Hello again and welcome to the chapter about counter-threats. This is another key idea within defensive play. Sometimes when our opponent is attacking one of our pieces, our best chance lies in starting our own attack at one of their pieces. So I would like to start with a very interesting example which comes up in the Italian. Perhaps you have seen this variation before. It's already a very sharp battle on the board. As you can see, black's king is left in the center. White has a serious development advantage, but on the other hand, in the long run, we can see that black is a pawn up, and also they have a much healthier pawn structure. But at this point, we have concrete problems to solve. White has just played here queen f3. We can see that they are targeting the pawn on f6. So what do you think? What should we do about this pawn? Which would be the best way to secure this pawn? The first thing that perhaps crosses our mind is to move this pawn. That's one of the most simple defensive ideas, so to speak, pushing the pawn. However, in this case, as you can see, this would open up the dark squares. White could profit from this diagonal by playing queen c3, and this would be extremely difficult for black to hold because the queen is coming quickly to attack black's king. So f6 can be discarded. We can check some other option. Perhaps we could protect it with a knight. However, if we move the knight, no matter I think where we put this knight, let's say we put it on g8, white would not think twice about their next move. Of course, with black's king in the middle, black about to create some kind of blockade in order to castle long, white would of course play here e7. This would be another disaster for black, because you can see that now the knight is attacked, and if we take back, well, of course, they will take on f6. So difficult for black to defend this pawn by normal means. In the game, by the way, with white Wang Jie and playing black Icelandic Grandmaster Hannes Stefansson. In the game, Stefansson quickly played the best move here, a counterattack directed at one of white's pieces. So which white piece do you think we could attack at this point? That's right. Very often, undefended pieces, they can be subject to this idea. So black played here the move queen a5, targeting the undefended rook on e1, giving white no time for taking this pawn. Well, we should still analyze it, of course. White is completely entitled to take that pawn and go for an attack. They could sacrifice the rook in this way. However, as you can see, after bishop takes, and we are giving check, so we don't run into the check on h8. White, in order to avoid a later idea with queen e4, they would play bishop f1. And at this point, what black should probably do is give back some of the material. Another important idea in defensive play, giving back material. How could that be done? Of course, we castle long so that we don't have to care about king safety anymore, or well, not so much. White would get back the exchange, but black would be on top in this position. You can see that they are having a more active position in general. Here, queen e4, good move. At this point, white would like to push this pawn, but it won't be that easy. One of black's ideas here is to trade queens, starting with queen f4. And also you can see that black is perhaps intending to go for an attack themselves at one point. So that's what would happen in the event of white sacrificing a whole rook. By the way, this position has come up many times in practice. This was not the first time that black played this move, queen a5. Very important move, targeting the rook on e1. In the game, white simply played rook e2, defending the rook, and now black can take advantage of this move, queen a5, similar to the intermediate moves that we checked in the previous chapter, because now with the queen on a5, we can move over this queen to the king side. So queen f5, not only move, but very practical. In this way, we win a tempo by offering the trade of queens, something that white should not accept, of course. They are a pawn down and they're playing for an attack. So white played queen c3, black took the opportunity to castle long. At this point, we could say that already black's problems are over. It's true that white has an advanced passed pawn, but it's very well protected by the blockading knight on e7. So not so much of an attack for white at this point. And actually, in this game, it's very entertaining, you will see. Actually, it's black who will start an attack now. White played rook e3, trying to get back that pawn on f6. However, now black hurried to push the central pawn. You can see there are several ideas with this move. Also, we would like to take the pawn if our queen is attacked. White played bishop d3, and Stefansson calculated very well at this point. He started with the move d4, of course trading queens would be great for black. White played queen before. Now we have threats all over the place, you could say. The queen is in the air, the knight is in the air, the rook is in the air, and so on. But Stefansson had everything calculated. Can you imagine what was black's next move at this point? That's right, we're going for an attack ourselves now, giving up the queen. D takes e3, this pawn is already thinking about queening. After white took on f5, you can guess their next move, of course. And it's not about giving check still. We can first play here e2, which now indeed creates the threat of rook d1 and e1 queen. So white played king g2. There were different ways of continuing here with the black pieces, but I like the way that he played. He simply took back on f5. So this means that material-wise, it's about equal, but this pawn is a very strong passed pawn. You can see that apart from the idea of queening here, what black might have in mind is to hunt white's king. White would have problems with a plan like rook d1, knight h4, check, and finally rook g1 mate. That's a nice mating pattern that black is toying with here. So very difficult for white to defend this game. What happened in the game was queen e4, and black carried out exactly the idea that we're talking about. Knight h4 check, and after king g3, you can guess the last move, right, in this game? That's right, rook d1. Very pretty, very aesthetic move. You can see that there is no good way for white to defend against the threat of rook g1 if they try to free a square for their king. In that case, we will, of course, just queen. So very nice game by Stefansson. You can see that it was extremely important for black to launch this counterattack. There was no normal way of protecting this pawn. They have to rely on this counterattack, attacking the rook on e1, this counter threat, and they get ready to castle long. Let's have a look at another example, which is more about a trapped queen. In this game with white pieces, Hismatulin and playing black Pankratov, you can see that after black's last move here, rook c4, white is having a big problem with their queen. It has no squares right now, and we can see that the upcoming threat here is, of course, a6. So what do you think we should do with our queen here? How to save Her Majesty? That's right, there is no natural way of saving the queen. We cannot retreat her or provide her with some square in a simple way. Our only chance here lies in starting a counterattack. And the piece that we have to attack, you're right, that's the knight. So we should play here the move b4. That's what Hismatulin played in the game. It's true that now the knight is in the air, but so is black's knight. And the concrete benefit of this move, of course, is that if a6, we can just take the knight now that the pawn is also in the battle. So after the move b4, black played knight c6. If they had taken on c3, by the way, this kind of position, you might argue that these double pawns are not ideal. On the other hand, please notice that white's bishop is really strong. We cannot say the same thing about that bishop. From personal experience, whenever I play the Slav with the black pieces, I try to keep my bishop on this diagonal instead with the black pieces. It's not so nice to have it staring at this wall. So after b4, black played the right move here, knight c6. And you can see now white has multiple problems again, because there is the threat of rook takes b4, there is the threat of rook takes c3. But Hismatulin understood this position very well. He knew that sometimes we can rely on, you could call this positional sacrifices. He played here queen takes b7, giving up a piece because after rook takes c3, white can play rook ac1. Very pretty way of thinking, I would say. White says, all right, you can have my piece, but now I'm in complete control of the queen side. What white is trying to do here, they're trying to, if black takes, for example, we take back. At this point, you can see that the knight is attacked. If it moves, we will take that pawn. And after that, white will have a great plan on the king side, sorry, on the queen side, advancing those pawns. I know a little about this myself from Slav games with the white pieces in the exchange variation, where you often get into this kind of situation with an open c file. White is very happy to sacrifice a piece on some occasions to end up with this, let's say, knight here, for example. We can take this pawn. It's a nice position for white, very strong passed pawns. So this didn't happen in the game because Pankratov also acted in very, you could say, anti-materialistic fashion, because he noticed that this kind of situation must be avoided with white taking control of the queen side. He played here a counter sacrificing move, knight takes d4. Well, what's going on here on the board, you might say? Simply black was going to give away that knight anyway, perhaps by taking in the center. There are new opportunities coming up for black here. If white takes with a pawn, black wouldn't think twice about sacking the exchange here. Rook takes f3, that's a nice move, and suddenly we didn't speak anything about the king side, but now it's time. You can see that after g takes f3, bishop takes c4, black has queen takes h4 coming up, and definitely white's weak king provides compensation for black here for the minus exchange. So in the game after knight takes d4, white took with a knight instead. Black took back, getting rid of that not so active bishop, and after e takes d4, well, white was slightly better in this position, but black later on managed to turn the tables and win the game. Still, what I was mainly interested in here from the very beginning was to show that in this position our only chance lies in starting that counterattack. Whenever you have a situation like this, where you notice that there is a big tactical problem, like in this case a6 trapping our queen, you should be ready to consider any move which creates a threat or check or capture, like forcing moves. In this case, a move like b4, even if it's perhaps not completely intuitive, you have to take such moves into account because it can be the only way out, as in this case. All right, we will continue. Let's have a look at, if this was complex, just wait for the next example. We have with the white pieces Kamer playing black Aronian. Very, very strong players, and at this point, I think Kamer has just played the move g4. Very complex position. Let's see if we can understand it. We are playing with the black pieces. We're down one pawn. On the other hand, you can see that white's king is not ideally placed. Our king is actually much safer here, but we have to look at this position from a concrete point of view. What's going on, what to do with the threat against our bishop. You can see that if we just retreat the bishop, we would run into 97. Annoying fork at black's pieces. On the other hand, we cannot take on d5. This would be ideal, of course, but in that case, white will take on f5. And still, yeah, it's still a very tricky position, of course, but seems to me that white will end up with a material advantage. So what to do then? Yeah, it would be a bit sad to retreat the bishop to c8. We would not like to bring back our pieces. It's the opposite. Now we need to develop our pieces. So what could we possibly play here? Well, what Aronian did, and I have some, you could say, reading memories of this situation. It's not new to me. One of my favorite books, I think I mentioned this, Gligorich's book, I Play Against Pieces. Gligorich has an example where he gives away his g-pawn, letting white take that pawn with check. And I remember I was very impressed by his decision, and that's exactly what Aronian does in this case. He plays the surprising move g5. So why on earth would black give away that pawn and even let white take the pawn with check? By the way, that's something that you and me, chess players in general, we're not very happy about that. We usually shy away from that. We don't like that they take our pieces with check especially. But what's the point of this move? You could say it's mainly about deflection. We're trying to deflect white's queen from the defense of the bishop. Now if they take, we can go back. And as you can see, it's a different story now. Since the queen is not protecting the bishop anymore, they cannot play knight e7 because in that case they are hanging the bishop. So this would create some, you could say, further disorder in white's position because there is the concrete threat of b5, and even you could perhaps consider something like f6 with a double attack. d6 check, you could go king g7. So white will have some problems to solve here, and it's not exactly easy to rescue the king. You can see that if the king moves, black will have checking possibilities. So tricky for white to play this position. In the game, Kamer didn't take this pawn. He actually carried out exactly the same move, but with mirrored colors and flanks. So I think you know which move I'm talking about, right? Very, very impressive. Young German grandmaster found a clever move here, b4. So he's basically doing the same thing as black, trying to deflect black's queen from this pinning position on the c-file. Aronian doesn't want to go for the endgame because he's having the the safer king. We don't want to play this endgame, of course. In that case, white's king would no longer be an issue for them. So in the game, Aronian just took on b4, and here we can see white's point. They played queen d4. That's a great square for the queen, where it defends everything. However, black has another surprise move coming up here. This example as such is very complex, but yeah, chess is a big world of opportunities. Here Aronian played the move knight g6. Nobody would expect that move. What's the point of this move? Basically, we're trying to trade off the knights, which will leave the bishop on c4 undefended. So complex for white to navigate in this position. G takes f5, knight takes e5 would indeed be very nice for black. This knight looks very powerful in the middle. So what happened in the game? They retreated the bishop here, bishop b3. Aronian doesn't want to trade queens, as we were discussing. He played here queen a3. Now if the queen goes back, I think we could give this check. So in the game they played king d2. And here came another. If so far this example has been a bit complex, here is another surprise for you. Black used a surprising pawn move here. So which pawn move would you consider with black? That's true. We should consider moves which creates threats. In this case, the move c5 is very strong. What's black doing here? Well, basically, they're trying to kick away white's queen from the center, and they know that if white takes, then suddenly the d file is open. When I looked at this position, I thought simply black would play rook d8, but actually white has a surprise here. Aha, we have a rook which is defending two fellow pieces at the same time, the overloaded piece, so white could play here. You got it, bishop takes f7. This would make things even more confusing, so we'd better not do this. By the way, this didn't happen in the game. After d takes e6, we should probably just take first and then bring the rook to, to the attack. Sorry. So this would be okay for black also. In the game after c5, Kramer played queen c3, keeping things closed. And at this point, Aronian finally takes on e5. You can see that yeah, if white takes back, we can probably just move our bishop again, and we have some threats on the queen side. So in the game, they took on f5 instead, and rook f e8. Finally, the position has normalized. We can see that material is still about equal, I think. 3 pawns each side, but I would probably take black in this position. Black's king is safer. The knight looks very strong. We have some ideas like c4, trying to open up the game, bringing the rook to c8 and so on. So interesting example. As you can see, we shouldn't rule out any solution in the tactical battle in positions like this with hanging pieces. A move like g5, nobody can honestly say that this is the first move that comes to mind, but it's very powerful on this occasion in order to deflect white's queen from its central post. So let's continue. Let's take a much simpler example. Our next example, it appeared in some kind of queen's gambit, I think, accepted possibly, or perhaps an Imso-Indian. Let's see if we can understand this. White has a pawn less. On the other hand, they have a very active position. You can see that all their pieces are in nice places, and they have a excellent bishop pair. White's last move here was knight g5. You can easily understand that move. They are hitting black's king side. They are intending to take on f6 and later on take the pawn on h7 with a strong attack, it seems. So what do you think we should do about that? How should we solve the problem of this threat against the h7 pawn or the h7 square? Well, in the first place, we should not play a move like g6. Sometimes when we are defending, we are limiting our actions to, what can I say, automatic moves, mechanic moves. That's one of them. Don't do this, please, because there is a very severe punishment here. That's right. When you move your pawns to the light squares and you don't have the dark squared bishop, that means problems on the dark squares. White would benefit from this by queen c3, and we cannot defend the knight in a good way, because if we block the queen in that case, as you can see, the pawn on f7 drops off. So please notice g6 completely impossible. Try to stay away from such mechanic defensive moves as g6. So what else is there to play? Not much actually, because again, we cannot block the white on this diagonal, because then we drop the pawn on f7 instead. So what black did here, they launched their own threat. Which threat? Aha, the same piece, interestingly enough, the same piece which is being attacked, we can use it to attack ourselves. So black played here h6. As simple as that. What's going on here? Well, after bishop takes f6, by the way, playing white Sedlak, and with the black pieces Drazic, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, and after queen h7, check, king f8, you can see that after all, this is not that serious for us. We have a safe square on e7 for our king. We're very happy, of course, that there are no pawns on the e-file. I mean, that there are pawns on the e-file. I mean, that would be disastrous if that file was open. We would basically get mated. White would perhaps play something like rook e1 to play queen h8 mate next turn, but that's not the case here. So white is missing more pieces to attack. Black has a very safe position. In the game they played here knight e4. Alright, we have to be a little careful picking the best square for our queen. We would like to stay close to this pawn because we don't want them to give check and take the pawn, right? But at the same time, you can see that the knight on e4 is undefended. Again, that's a typical situation when it comes to defensive play. You could say it's not undefended right now, but it's, you could say, subject to a fork, and that's what black did in the game. They played here the move queen f5. Very clever, because in this way we are attacking both the queen and the knight at the same time, basically forcing white to trade queens, because obviously if they go for the g-pawn, we go for the knight, and there is nothing which really troubles black in this position. White doesn't have enough pieces to attack black's king in the center. So after queen f5, white had to take simply on f5, and after e takes f5, you can see that black is definitely out of the woods here. It's already a safe position for black. They're even a pawn up. White hurried to play knight d6, getting back the pawn thanks to this fork at two black pawns at the same time. Black played bishop e6. There were other ways to give back the pawn, but this is probably the simplest one in order to clear the d-file in the endgame. So white took on e6, and after f takes e6, knight takes b7, rook takes d1, check, rook takes d1, king e7. A completely balanced endgame had emerged, and black later on managed to make a draw here. So if we go back again, I would say this example is a little about beyond this topic with counter threats. It's a little about not seeing ghosts, not being afraid of things that are not really that dangerous to us. Nobody has died because the opponent landed a queen on h7. I have used this idea several times myself. It's perfectly fine to play a move like h6. They can bring the queen, but only at the price of giving up their strong fianchetto bishop. This is what happened in the game, and black was completely safe. I think we touched upon this also a little earlier. Yeah, we touched upon this when I showed my game against Harmak. Yeah, I told you that if you have a rook on f8, sometimes it can actually be a disadvantage because you don't manage to run away with the king. So this is a good example. Black is very fortunate to have played rook fd8 earlier on, so that the king can safely move over to the center. All right, h6, very strong move by Drazic in this example. Let's continue. I wanted to show you one example about hanging pieces, or undefended pieces, you would say. That's a big difference, by the way. Hanging piece, it's being attacked, and undefended, simply it has no other piece defending it. So in this game between Sirota with white and Salciano with black, white has just played bishop h6. We have to quickly understand what's going on here. Of course, there is the threat of mate in one, and at the same time you can see the tension between the rooks on the e-file. So what do you think? How should we cope with this double threat? How to parry a mate on g7? Tricky, no? Because whenever we put something on e5 to block the white queen, white will be interested in playing f4, kicking away that piece on e5. On the other hand, you can see that there is a hanging piece here. Sorry, there is a undefended piece here, loose piece, the bishop on h6, exactly. So this is something black has in the pocket. At some occasion, they can try to attack that bishop, and that's exactly what happened in the game. Black could have taken on e1, however, in this case, after rook takes e1, you can see white has also control of the open file. If black now prevents the mate by playing f6, white has this very strong move, queen f3. We are targeting the pawn on f6, black cannot easily move the queen to f7 as they would like to do, and otherwise white will be ready to give check, and this would be very dangerous for black. We could, of course, also, after rook takes e1, we could play knight e5, trying to block the long diagonal in that way. But here white would have f4. Here we actually arrive at our key move in this example. Black's only move here, if you look carefully, you can see it consists in a counter threat. That's right, we have to play queen h4. In this way, we gain a tempo, you could say. We try to kick away the bishop from this square so that there is no mating motive on g7. If white takes, we will take back and we will be okay. However, the problem is that white could play here bishop g5. They are forcing us to now play queen somewhere where it touches the bishop on g5. That could be h5, for example. So I looked a little at this position, and I think the main problem here is that it's not that white will take on e5. The problem is that white can open up another file for their attack. You're right, they can play here the move c5. Not completely clear what's going on here, but it looks unpleasant for black. Their king is constantly in danger in this example. White would like to take and bring in the queen and so on. Some difficult endgame perhaps coming up in this case. So what happened in the game after white's move bishop h6 was that black played this interesting move, rook e5. A little similar to my game against Kveinis, where if you remember, he was playing on the f file and I played this move, rook f5, trying to slow down a little white's attack. If now f4, it's different, because if you compare this, comparatively speaking, if we look at this position, we had this before, but with the pawn on f2. We can go back to that, of course. We had this position before. White played queen f3, very strong move, trying to bring the queen to d5. And if I play queen d7 here, trying to bring the queen to f7, they will take on f6, unpleasant for black. On the other hand, in our example, yeah, this is what we looked at before. But what we're looking at now, it's this position. Now, as you can see, the pawn is here, so it's a difference. If white now plays queen f3, it doesn't have the same effect because the pawn is not under an attack anymore. We would safely play queen d7 and bring the queen to f7 if we are being checked on d5. In the same fashion here, if white plays rook e6, we could simply play king f7, attacking and defending. So in the game, after rook e5, clever choice by black. White took on e5, and after black took back, we have the move f4. At this point, of course, black's next move is not a surprise to you because you know the idea already. Definitely, this is a loose piece. It's an undefended piece. We have to exploit that. Queen h4, very, very important counter threat. In this way, black saves their skin. Now, after bishop d5, queen h5, you can see that it's different because the rook is now on d1. Small tactical details. That's the reason why black didn't want to take on e1. They wanted to leave the rook attacked, so there is no time for this move that we talked about in the other variation, right? I looked a little further at this. Rook e1, now we're basically tempo up. In the other position, white had c5 here. Black could play here the funny move h6, so that we can try to play knight g4 next turn. Yeah, very tricky position. One of the merits of this move is that we can perhaps rely on the check on c5 if white's bishop moves away. Yeah, tricky position definitely, but important thing here is that black is okay. Black has no concrete problems anymore. So after queen h4 in the game, white bailed out with f takes e5. Now you could say the game loses most of its interest after queen takes h6, e takes d6, c takes d6, rook takes d6. White managed to get back the pawn, but black has a very active position. They played here rook e8. As you can see, it's nice for black to bring the rook to the battle. They have a nice open file to work on, and at this point, white cannot take this pawn because in that case, black would give check. The king will have to go this way to avoid mate, and the queen, will just go back and pick up the rook on d6. So in the game, white did something else. I don't really remember what they played. Maybe they traded queens, possibly, and an equal endgame had emerged here. So complex example. What I wanted to stress here is that when you have this kind of tactical difficult situation, don't forget that you can sometimes rely on counter threats. In this case, it was very important for black to have this possibility of queen h4. They could not move the knight anywhere, of course. In that case, they would get mated. So for that reason, it's important to also look for opportunities against your opponent's pieces, like in this case, the bishop, the undefended bishop on h6. Okay, we should continue. Our next example, it's much sharper than this one. It's about opposite castled kings. This very funny looking position from the Sicilian. Playing white is Borje and black is Oxner. Wow, complex stuff, right? Let's see if we can understand this together. This knight is white, by the way. It's a white knight. It's not some misprint or something. The knight has actually landed there. Black's last move in this game was b takes c3, just for you to understand how this position came up. So what's going on here? Black took a knight on c3 because they are now creating the threat of mate in 1. And after that, they would be happy to take back the knight on f8, for example, with their knight. You can see also that there is another pending tactical capture here. The bishop takes a8, but black would be okay with giving up the exchange. After all, this is an open Sicilian with attack on both flanks. Material is not 100% top priority. So let's see if we can now figure out what to do with white. The first move to check, of course, is just to take the pawn. In that case, we don't have to worry about the mating threat anymore. However, black would take back the knight on f8. How to take back? Probably with the bishop, so that we can activate our knight. Yeah, that looks nice. So bishop takes a8, queen takes a8. What a strange position. We have material relation of 3 pieces and against 1 rook and against 2 rooks, sorry, and 1, 2, 3. 2 pawns, no? So 5 plus 5 plus 2, 12. And 3 pieces only 9. So black is 3 points down, I think. But look at this kind of position. It's the dream position for the minor pieces. Why am I saying that? Well, 1, there are queens on the board. This usually favors the side having the minor pieces in this kind of battle with rook versus minor pieces. And 2, you can see there are a lot of nice squares, like weaknesses on the board, like c4, c5, c3, a4, and so on. Plenty of scope for the minor pieces and not so much scope for white's rooks. So this would be a very nice position for black. I'm not sure who is better in this position, but I think I would take black here. Also, white's king seems a little more exposed than black's. So what did white play in the game? You could play this move. If this appeared to you, well, that's great news. That's a very logical move. Safeguarding the king, and now we can play the same variation. Bishop takes f8 and I take on a8 and I put the bishop on d4. This is much better than the previous line for white because, as you can see, now their king is much safer, their pawn structure is intact. But still, I think black would have some chances here. What did I look at? Knight c6 to push a5. Knight c6 and play a5, trying to open up the game. Maybe if white plays something like a4, we can bring a knight to c5 and try to bring out the pieces. And it's the kind of position, I think, where computers will favor white, but human-wise, it's interesting to play with black also. We have attacking chances, maybe some sacrifice on b3 later on. So what happened in the game was something else. White relied on a counter threat here. Believe it or not, how can white possibly go for a counter threat when they are about to get mated? Well, you have to use the same piece, exactly. Borje played here b4. Very pretty move, not intuitive at all. You would say you're not just begging for trouble, but what he noticed was that if black takes on b4, he gets an extra tempo. He can now prevent the mate and make space for the king at the same time. Of course, rook d4. Very clever move, so we're basically attracting the black queen to b4 in order to attack it this way. If now black gives check, we can come here and we have this move, bishop c1, always in the pocket. White would be winning because we are also hitting the rook, and this time there is nobody who can take back. So this would be bad for black, believe it or not. Please notice also that we can sometimes move over the king to the king side if necessary. So very clever move, b4. Let's see what happened in the game. Black just took on f8, exploiting the fact that we cannot take due to mate. So white took on a8 first, and after queen takes a8, they took on a5. So this time we have a different material relation. It's no longer 3 pieces versus 2 rooks. This time it's 2 pieces versus 2 rooks. So we're speaking about 2 minus exchanges for black, and that's not really ideal, especially if the queens come off. So black needs to keep the queens on. They played in this, at this moment, queen takes e4. White should be careful, of course. There are still attacking ideas for black. Rook d4, clever move, activating the rook and freeing a square for the king. There was queen b7, again, mate is in the air, but white has no problems here. If you like this kind of positions, well, definitely the open Sicilian, that's for you. Make sure to castle long. Queen d3 was played in the game, queen b2, king d1, and white later on went on to win. They have a material advantage, and it's not so easy for black to cook up an attack. I looked at this move, for example, but then I think rook h4 is possible, and it's not easy for black to get at white's king anymore. We can later on put it here, and who knows, maybe at some point we can go for our own attack. Comes to mind something like rook c4 attacking the bishop. Yeah, actually, maybe we could play it even here. Yeah, interesting. Why isn't that a better move? Yeah, I think both are okay. Maybe we want to provoke a weakness first or something like that. In any case, white has turned the tables here. White is better. You can see the point at queen b1. We can play bishop c1, so nothing is really going on here. Difficult move b4. Again, I'm boring you with this, but please notice we should not rule out any move in the tactical battle, especially when there are multiple pieces hanging, like in this case. Okay, let's continue. So far we have seen many situations where we are launching a counterattack, counter threat against one of the opponent's pieces, but of course also mating threats can be used in this sense. So here we have an example where the white pieces is playing Dudin and playing black Hungarian Grandmaster Erdos. So Erdos is having some slight difficulties here, as you can see, because the black king is a bit weak, the rook is hanging, and there is also the threat of bishop d5, pinning the other rook. So what do you think? How could we possibly save this? Couldn't we just take the bishop? No, not really. No, if you take the bishop, white will then pick up one of our rooks with queen d5, winning the exchange. So that's not good enough. What to do then? Can you think of some defensive idea for black here? Maybe some counter threaten something very serious? That's right. This is a good moment. Sometimes you can find the best moves by actually common sense. You can see that the queen is completely offside, it's not doing anything. So comparatively speaking, including queen c7, one way or another, it must be beneficial for us, right? White will defend against the mate, and definitely if you compare, I mean, this was the threat, right? If you compare this position with that, I'm just saying from general considerations, like if you're playing a blitz game or something, you should just compare these two situations and say that, oh, okay, if I have the queen on c7, it must be better because it's not doing anything on a5 or something like that. So that can be perhaps taken into account before you work out the variations and so on. At this point, one concrete benefit of playing queen c7 is that after we play rook d8, white will play, of course, bishop d5 to keep all the threats going, and here we could play the move king g7. Now, you would say, what's the difference then? Why can't we do this from the very beginning? So let's check it. If we play rook d8 first, white will play bishop d7, I was going to say, but that's wrong. White has a stronger move here, which definitely Erdos saw in the game. Aha, white can create their threat, a double threat. Very complex move, queen e2. What's going on? They're hitting the knight, and at the same time they have this nice little tactical trick coming up. So no matter where black puts the knight, like this for example, bishop d5 will come, and you can see that the rook is hanging on e6. Yeah, tricky tactics. So definitely makes sense to bring the queen back, because after g3, rook d8, you can see the difference now, since our queen is a little closer to the battle. If queen e2, black could again rely on a counter threat, right? We won't save this knight because in that case bishop d5 is killing us. What would we play? We should take measures against the other threat. We can attack this bishop using our queen. Queen e7, very clever, because now we're getting ready to take, and this doesn't work anymore because we have the rook defended, right? We can take now on d5. Yeah, very tricky tactics. If this is confusing, I would just recommend you to understand the main point, that bringing our pieces to the battle, it's making a lot of sense in general terms when we have this kind of complex tactical situation. So after, if we go back again, black started with queen c7, inserting the threat of mate, and only then they brought the rook to d8. Now this means that if queen e2, we have queen e7. So white continued with the other plan. They played bishop d5. Now, of course, we must do something about this threat, and the best way would be to unpin the rook, of course, moving the king. In the game, Erdos played king h7, but here white found the move. Dudin played h5, and they had some tactical possibilities. You can see that if we take this pawn, white would then give check. Again, we're speaking about intermediate moves. White would like to take the rook on e6, but only now when the queen is off the d file. So for that reason, yeah, it was a draw anyway, this game. I think he played something else at this point. Black, he perhaps moved the rook or something. But a safer choice would have been king g7, putting the king on a dark square, because this check is not so dangerous. We can always yeah, what can we do, by the way? I should ask you that, of course. Yeah, what do you think? What would be the best choice for black here? Still a tricky position. That is something which I call lifeline. The Swedish Grandmaster Axel Smith, he put it that way, lifeline, when you offer the exchange of an opponent's piece, which is currently undefended, in order to avoid some kind of tactical difficulty. And that's what we can do here. Exactly, queen e5. This is a clever move. Since white's queen is undefended, they don't have time to take our rook, and after they take our queen, we take back. And this would be a very nice endgame for black, right? This would be heaven for black after everything that we have seen, with a nice passed pawn coming up on the queen side. So this is not white's best choice. They should rather keep the queens on the board, queen c2 for example, and we could simply go back with the rook, and black would be okay in this position. Yeah, complex example, perhaps main takeaway here, understand that a move like queen c7, one way or another, it will be beneficial for us to include this kind of counter threat before we then solve our main problem here, in this case, trying to defend against all these threats. So queen c7, very clever move, winning a tempo, you could say, by the threat of mate on h2 and getting ready to bring the queen to e7. Also in the endgame, this kind of thinking is very important, so I wanted to include just one endgame example. This is a rook endgame, Mesaros with white and Shav Beneder with the black pieces. You can see that white is a pawn down, these pawns are connected. On the other hand, we have managed to cut off black's king on the 7th rank. I sometimes say to students that don't forget that in the endgame, mate is a very important idea. I mean, apart from the basic mates like mating with king and queen versus king and things like that, mating attacks are rather common in the endgame, even if there are few pieces on the board. One outstanding feature is that we will often use our own king. The attacker will use their king in the mating attack, because there are simply not so many other pieces available. So this looks grim for white, because these pawns are very fast, and you could say that at some point they could maybe even sacrifice, and then the pawn then continue to run with the pawns. However, white can resort to a mating idea, which is actually rather common. This is not the only game where this idea has been used. So what white did here, instead of trying to cope with these pawns, they went for to try to prevent the move c2, they went for a mating attack. They played here a nice move, king c6. Okay, we have a mate coming up. Black must do something with their king. Going this way does not make sense. We could just hide behind the pawn on b5. Black cannot get that white's king. They would have to go back, so it would be the same thing. So in the game, Schwab and Nether played instead king d8. White continued with their plan, king d6. I remember when I was a kid studying endgames, there was an example like this, but I think the pawns were already on the penultimate rank. Yeah, and even then this method would work, so it's good to know it. No, it's good to know it. King e8, again, black must prevent mate. White continues in the same way. They're very happy that black cannot check them with a rook. King f8, king f6, and king g8. Okay, we have arrived at a critical position here. We have to think in terms of intermediate moves. We're back in the previous chapter now, because an obvious move for us would be to play something like rook c7, perhaps, to keep the pawn controlled and then continue with the same business. However, in this case, after b4, this doesn't work anymore. Somehow, when the black king reaches d8, it will be touching the white rook, and that will give them time to later on continue with their plan. So this is wrong. In the game, white resorted to this typical intermediate move, rook g7 check. This is very clever because now if black goes that way, now we can indeed play this move. As you can see, the big difference here is that we have displaced black's king, so that b4 would be a terrible mistake. In that case, we would win the game, right? With king g6 mating them due to this funny position of black's rook. So that's the point here. In the game, they played here rook b4, and after that, yeah, the game is just a draw. White just took, and they came back with a with a rook. But of course, a more interesting variation was if after rook g7, black would go the other way instead, going this way. And here there is a difference. After rook c7, you can see we have the threat of mate again, thanks to having put black's king on f8. And after black approaches us, we can actually start our own attack on the king side. Now the time is right to push this pawn when our pieces are in perfect places. Black would play something like king d8, but what white should do here is simply keep the rook on the c file so that it's keeping control of these pawns. I think the most natural move here would be rook c5. If black now plays something like b4 and then tries to put the rook on this side, we could just continue. As you can see, at this point, thanks to our rook on the c file, these pawns are not that dangerous anymore. Black's best chance would be to try to bring in the king, but they are far away from doing that, right? We can just play rook c4. What will happen here is that black will approach the pawn, and it will all end in a draw here at some point. Something like, yeah, what could happen here? Something like this maybe, and white should be careful not to let them queen. You will have to play something like this, and yeah, I think you see my point here, something like this perhaps, and it would all end in a draw. Well, very long variation, then definitely not perfect, but you see my point here. White king is too far away, so this would end in a draw. So that's what could have happened after white's clever intermediate check if the king went back. White's point here, thanks to this intermediate move, now we win a tempo, so to speak, thanks to the mating threat, and we're ready to cook up counterplay with h5. So that's something about counter threats in the defense. We couldn't really cope with these pawns in a normal way. We had to rely on our own mating threat, so to speak. So let's see what we have looked at here in this chapter about counter threats. Let's check it from the very beginning. Our first example showed the usage of a clever counter threat, hitting white's rook in order to castle quickly. The defense of the pawn can wait. We also saw that in terms of intermediate moves, this move was very useful because it also enabled this move queen f5 to secure the pawn on f6. In our second example, we saw that white's queen was in danger, but the move b4 counterattack at the knight, counter threat, so to speak, at the knight on a5 solved white's problems. This Kramer-Aronian example was very, very complex. I don't think I understand it completely yet, but what you should notice here is that we are not obliged to move the bishop. We can look for other moves, and one of them is exactly g5. By the way, there was another similar move, b5. You could also play in that way, right? But I think Aronian shied away from this because he didn't like perhaps that white would have attacking chances on the king side. So that's why he played this funny-looking move. g5 with credits to Grand Master Gligorich many years ago. We had a look at this example where white was attacking black's king side and black simply ignored, you could say, the arrival of white's queen to h7 by playing h6, not seeing any ghosts, not being afraid of the queen arriving at h7 because the king could then safely move over to e7. We saw this complex game where white was very close to winning immediately here by using this mating pattern on g7, but black relied on the move queen h4. Yeah, this was not the initial position, this came a little later. It started like that, but black always had this idea in the pocket, so to speak, queen h4. We saw the complex Sicilian battle where many pieces were hanging, and white added one more capture to the menu, so to speak, playing here the funny-looking move b4, a very strong counter threat. Main point here at queen takes b4. Now we can attack this queen, a second threat, so to speak, gaining an important tempo, which means that we can safeguard the king in this way. and white's material advantage should take its toll. We had this example where white was about to win the exchange, however, black cleverly brought the queen to the defense, winning an important tempo by playing queen c7 after g3. They were already in conditions to save everything here, thanks to the queen's arrival to the center. They had this move available if white tried the tricky move queen e2. And finally, we saw the endgame example where white correctly played king c6, trying to cook up a counterattack, a mating attack, instead of somehow trying to defend against black's the looming advance of black's passed pawn. So very clever move. We're hunting the king, and yeah, there were some more details here, but this is the main idea. Constantly bother black's king with a mating threat. All right, thanks, and see you in the next chapter.